November 8, 1942, a dust storm rolls across the North African desert near Kasserine Pass, Tunisia. The sun bleeds orange through the haze. The sound is not the roar of aircraft or the thunder of artillery, it is the thin, almost humiliating whine of an engine lighter than anything German mechanics had ever heard. A battered Willys MB Jeep, its canvas top torn, its windshield shot through with 3 bullet holes, sits in the motor pool of a captured American supply depot. The tires still hold air, the engine still runs. And for the first time in the war, a group of Wehrmacht mechanics would experience something that no propaganda film, no tactical briefing, no general speech had ever adequately prepared them for: the logistical reality of American industrial might, compressed into a single vehicle. The year is 1942. Germany has conquered nearly all of continental Europe. The Wehrmacht, the most mechanized army the world has ever seen, rolls forward on an average of 12% of the fuel it requires, sustained by captured vehicles, slave labor, and the perpetual theft of resources from conquered territories. Every tank, every truck, every motorcycle must be maintained with meticulous precision because replacement is not guaranteed. Replacement in the German military apparatus is a luxury that exists primarily in the imagination. The supply lines stretch thousands of kilometers. Mechanics work with what they have, cannibalize parts from destroyed vehicles, and pray that the next shipment arrives before catastrophe. It is a system built on desperation masked as discipline. It is a system that has held, so far, only because German engineering is extraordinary, and because victory has, until now, come more swiftly than logistics demanded. But cracks have begun to form. El Alamein, Stalingrad, the first true defeats. And now, as the Allies establish themselves in North Africa, those cracks widen. The Jeep sits in the motor pool like an artifact from an alien world. Its design philosophy is utterly foreign to German military engineering. Where German vehicles were engineered to specifications, over-engineered to withstand punishment, built with redundant systems and precision-machined components, the Willys MB was engineered to a different principle entirely: standardization, interchangeability, abundance. The Jeep could be repaired not by master craftsmen, but by any soldier with basic mechanical knowledge and access to a spare part, which, in the American system, was guaranteed. The spare parts arrived not by the dozen, but by the thousand. They arrived regularly. They arrived reliably. They arrived because American industry did not design around scarcity. American industry designed around surplus. The mechanics who gathered around the Jeep that morning represented the elite of the Wehrmacht's technical corps. They had maintained the famous Panzer III and Panzer IV tanks that had dominated battlefields from Poland to North Africa. They understood engineering at the highest level. They had worked with vehicles that cost the Reich thousands of Reichsmarks and months of production time. To touch a captured American vehicle was both a professional obligation and a tacit admission. Something had changed in the war, and it could not be explained away by ideology or willpower. The German army, for all its efficiency and fighting spirit, was beginning to lose a war fought not primarily on the battlefield, but in the factories and foundries of the industrial world. And it was this realization, descending like a shadow across the motor pool in Tunisia, that would haunt every German officer who understood enough about industry to grasp what it meant. The first mechanic to examine the Jeep closely was Obergefreiter Klaus Schein, a 37-year-old from the Ruhr Valley who had worked in automotive manufacturing before the war. What struck him first was the simplicity. The engine was a 4-cylinder inline design, modest in displacement, nothing like the more complex engineering found in German vehicles. The tolerances were loose compared to what Schein was accustomed to. The parts fit together with an almost casual efficiency. Nothing was over-engineered. Nothing was gold-plated. Yet when Shane turned the ignition key, still present in the vehicle's dash, the engine turned over with an immediate, almost violent eagerness. It started. It ran smoothly. The mechanics exchanged glances that communicated a terrible understanding. This vehicle was not built to last a decade or to serve as the centerpiece of a precision manufacturing philosophy. It was built to be produced in numbers that made individual loss irrelevant. Shine climbed into the driver's seat. The wheel was larger than he expected, and it had a strange flexibility to it that seemed amateurish until he realized that it was deliberately designed to absorb shock. Everything in the Jeep's design, he began to understand, was dedicated to a single principle. This vehicle will be abused, neglected, driven by teenagers and farm boys who have never touched a steering wheel before the war, maintained by soldiers who cannot read German technical manuals, and it will still function. The leather seat was cracked and sun-faded. The dashboard was painted military drab and contained no unnecessary instruments. There was a compass. There were gauges showing fuel, temperature, and oil pressure, the bare minimum. There was no complexity hidden behind the dash. A soldier could access the engine and repair basic problems with a wrench and a soldier's common sense. There was no requirement for specialized knowledge or tools. Shine drove the Jeep around the motor pool perimeter. The steering response was immediate and honest. The suspension was soft compared to the rigid geometry of German vehicles. But this softness served a purpose. It absorbed the violence of North African terrain in a way that made prolonged driving physically endurable. The engine had what Shine could only describe as a casual reliability. It ran at a slightly lower RPM than comparable German engines, producing less power but also less wear. The fuel consumption rate was respectable without being remarkable. The real revelation came when Shine pulled the Jeep into the motor pool and lifted the hood for a full inspection. What followed was a detailed examination that would occupy Shine and his colleagues for the better part of an hour. They documented their observations in a technical report that would eventually be transmitted up the chain of command and eventually reach the desk of a General Oberst, who would read it with a growing sense of unease that no propaganda ministry could dispel. The report noted that every single component of the American Jeep could be manufactured in a German factory. There was nothing in the Jeep's design that represented a technological advantage over German engineering. What the Jeep represented was not superiority in engineering, but superiority in manufacturing capacity, in the decision to prioritize quantity over quality, in a national economic philosophy that treated military vehicles as consumable items rather than irreplaceable assets. But more than this, the mechanics discovered something that shook them even more profoundly. The spare parts were standardized not just within the Jeep, but across dozens of American vehicles. The bolts that held the Jeep together were the same bolts used in American trucks. The wiring harness used standard gauges. The fuel pump was interchangeable with units in other American vehicles. What this meant was that when a Jeep was damaged or destroyed, it could be cannibalized not as a unique entity, but as one node in a vast network of standardized parts. A destroyed Jeep did not represent a total loss, but a source of components for dozens of other vehicles. In the German system, a destroyed vehicle was a catastrophe. In the American system, it was just inventory rotation. Shane calculated something that afternoon that would have terrified any general who truly understood what it signified. He estimated that a single American factory could produce as many Jeeps in 1 month as Germany could produce in 3. He did not multiply this by 12. He did not need to. The number was already apocalyptic enough, and yet the Germans had 3 years of intelligence suggesting precisely this. American industrial production had been climbing steadily since 1939, visible in capture rates, in the material evidence of American supplies reaching the Soviet Union through Lend-Lease, in the increasing frequency with which American combat vehicles appeared on captured strength reports. But knowing a number is not the same as understanding it. The Wehrmacht mechanics understood it now. They understood it in their hands, in their professional judgment, in the knowledge that they were looking at not an engineering solution, but a solution born from industrial capacity so vast that the very rules of the war were different. Obergefreiter Schein's report noted the electrical system in particular. German vehicles were moving progressively toward electrical components that could withstand the demands of modern warfare. The American Jeep featured an electrical system that was, by German standards, fragile. It would not survive the intense electrical demands of a sophisticated fire control system or a sophisticated communications array. But it did not need to. The Jeep was designed for mechanical simplicity and reliability, and its electrical system was perfectly adequate for that role. The wisdom of this design choice only became apparent to Schein in the context of broader German failures. German industry, starved for copper and struggling with raw material scarcity, had invested heavily in complex electrical systems that required massive amounts of precious materials. The American approach was to use electrical systems sparingly and intelligently, accepting that they would not serve combat functions that German engineering insisted upon. The report documented the fuel system, which impressed the German mechanics despite themselves. American gasoline of the era was of generally consistent quality, and the fuel delivery system on the Jeep reflected this confidence. German vehicles had to accommodate for the highly variable quality of fuel available from conquered territories and synthetic production facilities. This meant complexity, redundancy, and constant adjustment. The American system assumed fuel purity and reliability. This was not a mark of German superiority in engineering, but a reflection of German scarcity and American abundance. Schein and his colleagues were granted permission to conduct a test drive, taking the Jeep into the desert surrounding Kasserine Pass. The condition of the roads, or rather the absence of roads, was the decisive factor in their evaluation. The North African desert is not hostile in the way that a battlefield is hostile. It is hostile in the way that infinity is hostile. It spreads in every direction, offering no landmarks, no shelter, no mercy to machines. The Jeep's suspension, designed to be soft and forgiving, proved to be exactly what was needed. The vehicle bounded over rocks and wadis with a kind of mechanical enthusiasm that surprised the German mechanics, who had been conditioned to believe that proper engineering meant rigid structures and precise control. The American designers had understood something that German peacetime engineering had not fully internalized. A military vehicle that would be driven by soldiers in conditions of extreme duress needed to forgive driver error and mechanical stress through flexibility rather than rigidity. The engine performed without complaint. The fuel consumption was acceptable. The vehicle returned to the motor pool with its original fuel gauge barely moved. Schein calculated the operational range, approximately 200 kilometers, perhaps more, with careful driving. It was not a particularly impressive range by technical standards, but it was a range that could be maintained reliably without the constant mechanical adjustments and repairs that German vehicles required. A German truck with the same operational range would have required an elite mechanic within 200 kilometers. The American Jeep seemed indifferent to its level of maintenance. It ran because it was designed to run under conditions of human imperfection. What Schein and his colleagues did not fully express in their formal report, but what communicated itself through every line of technical notation and observation, was a creeping understanding of strategic catastrophe. They were not looking at a superior vehicle. They were looking at the material manifestation of an economic system that could afford to think in terms of abundance, where Germany could only think in terms of scarcity. Germany could build one incredible tank. America could build 10 adequate tanks and still have factory capacity for other needs. Germany could build a truck that would last a decade with careful maintenance. America could build a truck that was acceptable for the duration of the war and could be replaced without emotional or economic consequence once the war ended. The implications cascaded through the German military leadership like an infection that nobody quite dared to name. If America could build Jeeps like this in the quantities that supply officers reported, what else could America build? The Allies were reporting to the interrogators that American industry had deliberately moved toward standardization, toward designs that could be easily repaired and mass-produced. American military doctrine, it appeared, was making a fundamental assumption about the nature of the war. It would be long, it would be won or lost in production capacity, and the nation that could sustain and replace its equipment faster than the enemy could destroy it would prevail. The Wehrmacht, by contrast, was built on a different assumption. German military strategy had been predicated on rapid, overwhelming victory before economic constraints became decisive. Blitzkrieg was not merely a tactical philosophy. It was an economic necessity dressed up in military terminology. Germany could not sustain a prolonged war of attrition. Germany could not replace its losses at the rate at which a powerful enemy could inflict them. Germany could not, fundamentally, fight the kind of war that America was preparing to fight. The Jeep sitting in that Tunisian motor pool was not a vehicle. It was a confession. It was American industry admitting something that no general needed to state. We believe we will win this war, and we believe we will win it by outproducing you. This realization took different forms in the minds of different officers. Some rationalized it away. The Jeep was adequate, but not impressive. German engineering was superior, and this would eventually tell. Others recognized the horror in what they were seeing, but lacked the political power to act on that recognition. General Friedrich von Paulus, commanding the German Sixth Army at Stalingrad, would receive reports of American production capacity and would have been able to articulate with perfect clarity what it signified. But recognition and the ability to alter fundamental strategy are not the same thing. The political structure of Nazi Germany did not permit the kind of fundamental reevaluation that such information demanded. Schein filed his report. It was filed, read, analyzed, and filed away. It changed nothing. The mechanics who had examined the Jeep were rotated to other duties. The Jeep itself was stripped for parts that could serve German vehicles more directly. In a sense, the American engineers had been vindicated. The Jeep, built to be expendable, was expended. Its components were cannibalized into the German supply system, and this too was precisely what American military planners had anticipated. They had designed the Jeep understanding that it would be captured, examined, and potentially dissected. They had confidence that American industry could build more Jeeps than Germany could capture them. Yet the examination of that single vehicle did produce one documented effect. Through the autumn and winter of 1942, German military staff began requesting urgent reevaluations of American production capacity. Reports flowed from industrial intelligence services suggesting that American output was not merely higher than German output, but potentially exponentially higher. By 1943, German planners were aware, though many chose not to fully acknowledge, that America was producing roughly 1/2 ton of military equipment for every ton that Germany produced. This ratio did not stay constant. It grew. By 1944, American industrial output was nearly triple that of Germany, despite Germany's supposed advantages in organization and engineering precision. The production figures were staggering. Between 1942 and 1945, American industry would produce approximately 643,000 Jeeps. Each Jeep would carry soldiers, supplies, and communications. Each Jeep would be designed to fail, in a sense, in the knowledge that failure in one vehicle was acceptable when thousands of identical replacements existed. The American military did not fear the loss of a Jeep because loss was built into the strategic equation. The Germans feared the loss of any vehicle because loss threatened the precarious balance of their logistics. Obergefreiter Schein survived the North African campaign. He would eventually be reassigned to the Eastern Front, where he would observe similar patterns emerging as the Soviet Union, armed with American Lend-Lease supplies, demonstrated a capacity for numerical replacement that mirrored American philosophy. Schein would never command great armies or influence the course of history in ways that would be remembered by nations. But he carried with him, until his death in 1956, the memory of that November morning in Tunisia, when he placed his hands on an American Jeep and understood, in a way that was utterly visceral and beyond denial, what the future of warfare would be. It would not be won by the nation with the most elegant engineering or the most ruthless tactical doctrine. It would be won by the nation with the factories. The Jeep itself, that particular Jeep, with the 3 bullet holes in its windshield, was broken down in the weeks after its examination. Its engine block would eventually power some German truck. Its transmission would be scavenged. Its chassis would be cut apart and incorporated into improvised German vehicles. Nothing would be wasted. The careful Germans would use everything. And yet nothing they did with those salvage parts could change the fundamental arithmetic of the war. They had one factory producing Jeeps at a certain rate. America had many factories producing Jeeps at many times that rate. The Jeep was a democracy on wheels, literally built to the principle that individual vehicles mattered less than the capacity to produce them. German vehicles were hierarchies of precision. American vehicles were populist commitments to abundance. What the Wehrmacht mechanics understood, standing in that motor pool, was something that few military establishments had ever had to fully internalize. That war, in its modern, industrialized form, was not primarily a competition between generals and soldiers, but between nations and their economic systems. The Jeep was not a weapon. It was a declaration. It declared that the United States believed itself capable of sustaining the kind of production that would make victory inevitable, provided only that the war lasted long enough for that production advantage to manifest itself militarily. And here is where the deepest meaning of the Jeep emerges from history. The American military did not design the Jeep to be the most advanced vehicle on the battlefield. It was not. German tactical vehicles had capabilities that the Jeep could not match. But the Jeep was designed to be available when needed, in the numbers needed, sustained by an industrial system that understood that war is not won in individual engagements, but in the cumulative weight of resources brought to bear over months and years. The Jeep represented a faith in abundance that was almost religious in character. It was a statement of belief that, in a war between different economic systems, the system that could produce more would ultimately prevail, provided that it could translate that production into operational capability. The mechanics who examined that Jeep could not have articulated this in precisely these terms, but they felt it in their bones. They felt it in the mechanical honesty of a vehicle designed without pretension, in the surprising reliability of a vehicle that had no illusions about being preserved, in the standardization that made every component interchangeable and every repair possible without recourse to specialized expertise. The Jeep was American democracy in automotive form. Individual vehicles mattered less than collective capacity. Specialization mattered less than adaptability. And the belief that we can replace what we lose mattered more than the belief that we must preserve what we have. When Schein filed his final report on the Jeep, he concluded with an observation that his superior officers found troubling precisely because it was accurate. He noted that the American vehicle represented not a superior engineering achievement, but a fundamentally different approach to the relationship between industry and military force. Where German military doctrine had been built on the assumption that the war would be brief and decisive, American military doctrine appeared to be built on the assumption that the war would be prolonged and would be decided by the side that could sustain production over years. The Jeep was evidence that American planners believed themselves capable of fighting that kind of war. And if American planners believed themselves capable, and if American industry could sustain that belief with production figures like those they had been receiving, then the only rational conclusion was terrifying. It was this conclusion that German officers from 1943 onward would struggle to accept and yet could not ignore. The Jeep had spoken, and what it said was unchangeable by force of will or military virtue or ideological commitment. What it said was that Germany would lose this war, not necessarily in any individual battle or campaign, but in the long attrition of industrial capacity. The war would be decided in the factories, in the foundries, in the mountains of raw materials, and the populations of workers, and the organizational capacity to translate those raw materials into the implements of war. And in that competition, Germany was already defeated. The Jeep was just the first evidence of a truth that would become undeniable over the next 3 years. The symbols of abundance that the Jeep represented, the spare parts, the interchangeable components, the casual reliability of an inexpensive design, would haunt German military planning through the war's end. Every captured American vehicle confirmed what that first Jeep had revealed. Every report of American production capacity that filtered through intelligence channels amplified it. The Jeep was not unique, it was representative. It was the visible manifestation of an industrial system that had been organized from the beginning of American rearmament with the assumption that this war would be fought and won on the battlefield of production. The epilogue of this story does not conclude in triumph or defeat at any particular moment. It concludes, rather, in the slow grinding certainty of history asserting itself. The Germans, recognizing the dimensions of their productive disadvantage, attempted various solutions. They redesigned their approach to tank production, moving toward standardization. They consolidated their manufacturing base, attempting to replicate something like American efficiency. They drafted women into factories. They pushed production to unsustainable levels through slave labor and coercion. None of it was sufficient. The fundamental arithmetic remained unchanged. The Jeep had stated a truth that Germany could not alter through any exercise of will. America could build more than Germany could destroy. By 1945, the Allies were producing roughly 15 million tons of military equipment annually. Germany, even at peak production in 1944, had never exceeded 4 million tons. The ratio was apocalyptic, and it was a ratio that was baked into the Jeep, visible in the manufacturing philosophy that had produced it. The Jeep said that America believed itself capable of this production level. The Jeep said that American planners had organized their military doctrine around the assumption of material abundance. The Jeep said that victory would belong not to the nation with the most brilliant generals, but to the nation that could afford to replace its losses indefinitely. Obergefreiter Klaus Schein died in 1956, 11 years after the war ended, having spent the intervening years in Soviet captivity as a prisoner of war, and then, in civilian life, rebuilding what remained of German industry. He would have witnessed the arrival of American occupation forces in Germany and would have seen the factories of the United States operating at a level that made even his wartime experiences seem modest by comparison. He would have understood with the clarity of a man who has learned through bitter experience that the war had never really been in doubt after roughly 1942. It would have been decided by production capacity. The Jeep was a symbol of that inevitability. It was a symbol of abundance in a world being shaped by scarcity. It was a symbol of a nation that believed itself capable of producing more than its enemies could destroy. And more profoundly, it was a symbol of a nation built on the assumption that individual lives and individual vehicles were renewable resources, that loss was acceptable when replacement was guaranteed, that the way to win a modern war was not through the perfection of strategy, but through the application of sufficient material resources over sufficient time. The Jeep represented American democracy translated into metal and rubber and gasoline, the belief that what matters is not the quality of what you produce, but your capacity to produce more of it than anyone else.